hurl a rock at them.
And if Llewellyn ap Griffith's men could avoid the arrows...
If that happens, then this great iron-shod portcullis will come crashing down to bar your way.
Within these heavy fortifications, the inner heart of the castle was a place of security.
Castles are not just about attack and defence, they're also for living in. All around this big open space would have been stables and huts for the workmen, for the blacksmiths and farriers that kept everything going.
Even in the midst of peace, every precaution was taken in case of war.
You cannot have a castle without a spring, and this is the well going down to a natural spring. You must have a water supply that cannot be poisoned. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how thick your walls are, you cannot withstand a siege. They could last out here for months.
But Mike's investigations have revealed a potential problem. At first glance, there seems to be a weak point in the defences.
It's a universal feature of castles that they have very, very thick walls. And what you don't want is you don't want where your arrow loop is to be a weak section of wall, because it would be a very thin bit of wall there, and the enemy would know to aim their siege machines, their great big boulders from their trebuchets, to come crashing into these weak spots.
The trebuchet was every castle's enemy. When the trigger was released, the 3-ton counterweight dropped, hurling massive balls hundreds of meters. These missiles were easily capable of destroying any weak points in castle walls, but the castle engineers found a solution.
In fact, it's one of the strongest parts of the wall, because the architect has built this elaborate embrasure. So there are steep angles coming back here, reinforced by this angle here, reinforced by this archway. The consequence of that makes it very difficult for me to shoot my bow. I can't shoot a longbow in here, because to shoot a longbow, I need that much room. To pull up a strong bow, I need to be able to move it like that.
The longbow is too big to fit into the embrasure, the gap designed to reinforce the arrow loop.
So the archer with a longbow is having to shoot this far away.
Castle defenders had to be as good with their weapons as their engineers were at design. And there were other mysteries. On the outer walls of Caerphilly are curious holes set at regular intervals of about 1 metre. These holes supported a wooden structure, the hoard, that overhung the stone walls.
In the Middle Ages, these planks would lift up and the soldiers would be here ready, and they would be crashing down these great boulders onto the heads of anybody brave enough to get to the base of the walls.
Caerphilly Castle proved impregnable, and it could be said that Wales would not be part of Britain had it not been for this mega fort. De Clare's arch-rival, Llewellyn ap Griffith, never got used to this enemy fortress in his backyard.
Caerphilly was never taken. Caerphilly was here stamping its mark in the landscape. In fact, Llewellyn ap Griffith was so angry about Caerphilly, he was so angry with Gilbert de Clare plonking this castle in his lands, that when the young Edward I came to the throne, Llewellyn refused to pay homage, and that kicked off the Welsh Wars. That's the snub that made Edward I come into Wales and build a chain of castles.
Using the kind of design seen at Caerphilly, Edward I stamped his authority over the land of Wales. Within 10 years, this proud independent country had fallen to the English.
But the great thing that he did was to ensure that this wasn't just an ephemeral campaign against the princes, which is what had happened in the past over and over again. He was there to stay.
And this was the start of unification that led to the creation of the present-day United Kingdom. However, megaforts were not always symbols of power and aggression. Sometimes they could be quite the opposite. This extraordinary landscape conceals one of the strangest and most secretive defense systems ever devised. When the locals were faced with danger, they simply melted into the ground, leaving no trace. Ancient Discoveries is investigating a defensive construction that would not look out of place in a futuristic science fiction film. Not all castles and forts are symbols of aggressive conquest. Hidden in this bizarre and magical natural landscape are tiny clues as to a completely different style of ancient defense: invisibility. Central Anatolia in Turkey looks more like a film set than a real place. But for the ancient peoples who lived here, the threat of conquest was very real.
You have to look at a map and you realise just how strategically significant this particular landmass is. Everybody had their eyes on this central area.
The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Arabs, the Ottomans. Every major empire came to Anatolia in search of booty, slaves, and blood.
Anatolia is a crossroad in between the East and West, culturally, economically, and in every aspect.
But the people here were poor farming folk with few natural resources.
There's not much ground to cultivate. There's not much land on which you can grow grain.
Lacking the wealth to build mighty fortresses, the peoples of Cappadocia opted for another defense: disguise.
The volcanic rock is very easily excavated, and they could dig themselves houses. And of course, large palaces.
These palaces and houses were excavated over thousands of years, from 5000 BC right through until the present day. Even now, people still make their homes in them, 7,000 years after they were first dug. This complex is the longest continuously occupied fortress in the world. And in times of peace, these tunnels were used to live normal lives.
They started to organize their stables and the places where they could cook, and the kitchens and the wine cellars.
But they remained alert to danger. From their high vantage point, known as the castle, the people could retreat through a 50-kilometre-long network of tunnels and disappear. The immensity of this labyrinth was just one attribute. The Cappadocians had subterranean treasure rooms, vaults where they kept their valuables. And attackers often couldn't even get into the complex because entrances were invisible, camouflaged against the rest of the mountainside.
It would have been very difficult to attack them. The entrances were not very obvious. There was no way people would know that there was such a mass of underground connections. They wouldn't have known that there was any wealth. The people could hide in these structures.
They turned disguise and deception into defense. Meanwhile, across the globe in Central America, ancient people turned the tactic of deception into aggressive counterattack. Around 600 AD, the Mayans developed an unusual way of defending their own mega forts. It involved hiding a colony of stinging bees in soldier-like dummies. An ancient Mayan text, known as the Popol Vuh, explains the tactic.
They made mannequins. It was as if they had made people. Next, they lined them up on the parapet.
And somehow or other they would coax a colony of bees into the head, and these would be mounted on the ramparts of the fortifications.
The Mayans would place these human-looking bee bombs on and around the fortress. The idea was that an attacking army would come charging in, and when they swiped at the dummies thinking they were Mayan soldiers, the bees would get nasty.
As soon as, of course, they hit it, it should shatter, and then all the bees would come out.
When they get aggressive, they don't differentiate between anybody. It would be, I suppose, like climbing into a bucket of barbed wire that would chase you. It's pretty unforgiving, and one hive of bees smashed down amongst the enemy would give you quite a wide area of panic.
Richard Windley wants to know how the bees will react to being attacked.
It's difficult to know just quite how aggressive they'll be. They may simply be disorientated, or they might actually be quite aggressive. It's going to be me that's going to actually be striking the head. So if I turn and run, then it will be for a good reason.
There is one difference.
will have protection on, whereas the soldiers who were attacking these fortifications would be wearing not very much at all.
But even a modern beekeeping suit is no guarantee.
Because sometimes you get bees that are more intelligent than others, and they realise if they can't get in at the top, they'll get in at the bottom, and if your ankles are exposed... I've had them change my shoe size a few times.
Can you tell us the horror stories after we've done it?
For safety reasons, Richard is performing the test in daylight, but it was at night that the deception was most effective.
One can imagine that sort of flow of adrenaline, the apprehension, going into battle for the first time, they would be like a sort of hair trigger. They'd just be waiting to whack something. They'd be waiting to actually attack.
At first, the attack looks like it hasn't worked. The bees stay around the head. Bees only become airborne and active within a certain temperature window, depending on the species.
Start to get their bearings, I think they'll be a lot more airborne.
But soon the bees start to warm up and take to the air.
This is still sort of reasonably intimidating, actually. If I was just stood here with bare chest and bare head, I think this would be pretty scary. I mean, I'll be out of here fairly quickly, I think. I wouldn't want to hang around.
But Richard's clothing is protecting him from more than the first sting.
Of course, once one of these things is stung and that scent gets into the air, then the whole thing will wind up and they'll get more and more aggressive.
As with all bioweapons, there is an element of luck. The night couldn't be too cold, plus the bees would need to start stinging to make the other bees aggressive. That being said, any defense is better than none, and the bee-filled dummies would have complemented other more traditional methods of defense. In 1453, during a great siege, the largest cannon that had ever been built was put to devastating effect. It was commissioned by Sultan Mehmed II to destroy the walls of one of the largest and most durable fortresses in history, Constantinople. To understand why the great Sultan went to such lengths in his efforts to take the city, researchers are piecing together evidence that stretches back thousands of years to the empire of the Romans. In 300 AD, Rome was ruled by one of history's most celebrated figures, the Emperor Constantine. What set Constantine apart from earlier emperors was his conversion to Christianity.
Constantine stamped Rome onto Christianity and stamped Christianity onto Western Europe.
Without him, Christianity may not have become the great religion of Europe and the Middle East in the first millennium. But the Emperor Constantine had a dilemma.
During the 4th century, Rome was threatened by barbarian tribes from the north. Constantine decided that the struggle of defending Italy wasn't worth the candle.
He decided to move his capital 1,400 kilometers east to the city of Byzantium, which he then renamed after himself, Constantinople.
And finally, Constantinople became the successor to Rome and the Roman Empire.
A new Rome.
The Roman Empire wasn't over when they moved to Constantinople. It had just regrouped and moved to a stronger position.
The secret of its success was its location, surrounded by water on 2 of its 3 sides. But the new capital had one strategic flaw.
On its rear side, it just has this very flat, undulating country. So what the Byzantines have to do is they have to develop massive, monstrous walls in order to protect themselves.
A large inner wall provided elevation from which to shoot arrows, larger catapults, even cannon. Beyond this, moats and lower walls provided further lines of defence. Nick Hall, keeper of artillery at the Royal Armouries,